Seven Angels is, yes, a chamber opera for seven voices and an ensemble of 12 players. It's my first opera, and it was quite an experience going through the process of writing an opera. I'd never written anything longer than 18 minutes, I think, until I wrote this piece, and this piece is an hour and a half. So the sheer, the scale is always, that's the most challenging part of the opera, really. But when I came to actually work on it, because there were seven scenes in the piece, breaking it down into smaller bits, it became much more manageable. And I think that's like anything, that's the way you have to kind of approach it. The story is about these seven angels who land in a deserted place, and they try and work out kind of what happened to this ruined area, and they create a sort of parable. And during the course of the piece, they become the characters in it. But sometimes they go back to being angels, and they're able to kind of comment on what's going on or drive the story in a different direction. And the story that they create is really like a fairy tale. There's a king and a queen who were initially in love, and their son, the prince, who they give everything to the extent that they spoil him, and he becomes very fat, basically. And they have four servants who serve them, but they treat them very badly. So gradually, the servants leave, and he's left with the waitress serving the prince. But basically, they start running out of food. The gardens that the king and the queen have maintained has fallen apart. They've lost interest in it, and the prince is gradually forced to realise that he's got to do something. And the waitress kind of opens his eyes to seeing what he can do. And in the second part, there's a big conference where these visitors from other lands come because they're running out of food as well. They come to the king and queen to kind of, they want part of they think the last garden, the last food left on earth. And the king and queen try and pretend that everything's okay, and they serve them meals, but gradually everything is running out. And basically it comes to a climax where everything goes, basically. The world that we created is then blown apart, it's destroyed, and it just sort of turns to dust. And at the end, they one by one they turn back into angels, their initial starting point. But the prince and the waitress fight against this and try and, in a small way, in the way that they can do that, they try and remember, they try and retain who they were. And in this they try and, it's an act of defiance in it, if you like, but also of love. Yes, one of the challenges with the piece was having so many voices, really. We have these seven singers on stage, and they're on stage most of the time. So sometimes they're treated almost like a choir, especially towards the beginning and end of the piece, when they're angels and they don't so much have their own character at this point. They're more of a group, really. So at this point there's a lot of, yes, choral writing, really, in a sense. And gradually as the piece goes on, as they become each character, they find their identities, and the vocal writing becomes more individual. So, for example, the king, who's a lowish baritone, his writing becomes quite jumpy. He's quite forceful. The prince goes from being kind of like a screaming boy, really, to becoming quite lyrical. It's quite an interesting trajectory that he has. And the waitress goes from, she's merely serving on one of the servants, but she gradually gets her identity throughout the piece, and she her music becomes quite expressive as well. We spent a long time before I started writing the music, just playing around with ideas and how we can tell this story. Part of that was visiting places and talking to. We talked to a futurologist, for example, about how they predicted populations and where the, how climate change could affect humanity and all these kind of questions, because the idea of climate change and Paradise Lost was the sort of starting point. That's sort of how we came together on this. And then once we'd come up with a very rough sort of outline, Glyn went away and began writing different scenes, which he had sent to me. We'd then talk about that, talk about maybe little changes and things. But then once I was kind of happy with the scene, I would then go away myself and start writing it. And during that process, there were sometimes moments when I wanted to change the text a bit, or either cut things out, or maybe reword things a little bit. And Glyn was always very supportive of that. So it was very nice having that kind of collaboration as well. And John Full James, the director, was very a useful person to talk to about things. It made a nice change from, for example, writing an orchestral piece where really I go into my room and it's just me there working on it. What's very nice about opera is that collaboration. It's you do feel much more part of a team of things, which you are. You have to be. And so, you have to be prepared that sometimes people will say they want you to change things a bit, and sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's not. But it's something I find very productive and very nice.